Bon. Good evening, everybody. I did a wee video the other day about the new light, new shite about higher education. However, we're going to get back on track now. That to my left, I have Dino, who's going to tell us about one of his a recent karting experience. Because as we know, he is the Ayrshire kartbuster. So he's going to crack on now with his experience, and we'll see how we get on. I think you've got 35 minutes in it, so we'll go straight into it.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Yeah, so I'm going to start off tonight with an experience from last Friday, following on from last week's video about the chronology, 1914 chronology, and how it doesn't mathematically work. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll just talk about a wee bit about Faithful and Discreet Slave. So anyway, last week we spoke about 1914 chronology, and that you can't compare a biblical prophetic year to a solar calendar year. You can't transpose one onto the other because they don't match. So anyway, I was walking past one of the favourite places for the carts to be placed in there, just at the river. So I was walking along and I see the cart. There's an old sister in a wheelchair parked next to the cart. Um, Bless her, in a wheelchair, elderly woman out doing it, respect. But where the cart sits at this shop front window, there's a bit of pavement, and then there's a brick wall running parallel to the shop window and where the cart is. And on the brick wall, there's this elder that I spoke to before, his wife, and one other sister that I spoke to before. And they're sitting on the wall. And this wee old lady in the wheelchair by the cart herself. I'm thinking, it's amazing how they can go out in the carts, they can just be three or four of them just standing or sitting about, gassing to themselves. And this is all counting as sacred service. Anyway, I approached the cart, looking at the magazines, and the elder's wife approaches me, not the elder. And I'm sure they recognise me. They knew me from before, like the T-shirt, by the way.
Sure.
Um,
I did notice that you've got Ian Curtis behind you, and yeah,
yeah, I was wondering.
that's Ian.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
So the wife approached me, and I says, "Look, I says, I want to ask you a wee question about your chronology." And I got the reasoning book out, and I says, "I know you don't use this now." I said, "But turn to the page in the reasoning book where the calculation is." And I said to her, I don't think this adds up. I says, 7 times 360 equals 2520. I says, do you see a problem there? And she's going, no. So anyway, I went through it, explained about the difference between lunar years, prophetic years, and solar years, and explained how you can't transpose one onto the other equally, that's going to fall short, and therefore the mathematics or the arithmetic just doesn't add up, and you can't reach 1914 from using those years. So in fairness, she listened to me, but then she said, well, I don't really think about 1914. I don't go into the nitty gritty. And I just looked at it. I said, you don't go into the nitty gritty. I says, well, clearly someone in your organization a long time ago did go into the nitty gritty. Your whole doctrine, your whole organization is based on this calculation and arriving at the year 1914. And you're basically saying, I just think about the signs of the times as what's happening is all evidence. And it's like water off a duck's back. It just means absolutely nothing. One of your commentators from the last video, I think it was Merino, I think his name was, he'd made the point that it's like they shut their minds off. You could present any evidence to them, and they just close their minds to it. They just don't get it at all. A phrase I use, it's like leading a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, you know. Um, And also, I like the
Uh,
Jonathan Swift quote, where Jonathan Swift says, "You cannot reason a person out of a position that he did not reason himself into in the first place." And it just makes me realize that for a lot of these witnesses, it's
yeah,
they haven't reasoned, they haven't used reason. They've just accepted what they've been told without really um, testing it through reason and logic. So when you present reason and logic to them, it means nothing to them, really.
yeah.
Spoke to eventually, oh, in fact, yeah. Then at that point, the other sister that was there, kind of quite cheeky sister, been cheeky with me before, she came up to me, and I'm standing in front of the cart, and she says, "Would you move just away from the cart because people passing by can't see the cart?"
Oh
And,
my
and as she
God.
said that, the sister I was speaking to, she stepped a few steps back the way with her back towards the window of the shop. So she's now like a couple of feet away from me. It's a bright sunny day. There's actually nobody passing by. I just stood where I was and I says, "No, actually, I'm fine standing where I am," because it's like their way of trying to control you. You
Yes,
know,
yeah, yeah.
I said, "I'm fine." And I says to the other sister, I said, "Can you see me from here?" I mean, she's only a couple of feet away. "Can you see me? Can you hear me from here?" And
Oh
of
my
course,
God.
she could, Um, so anyway, they got the old sister in the wheelchair. They wheeled her away. She was actually saying, "No, I want to listen to this," but they were wheeling her away to get her away from me.
It
So
was,
she
it
goes
was,
on to
it's
this.
just, it was a case of that you were you were trying to reveal the truth.
She was just getting her out of
Uh,
there. But
oh dear.
eventually, they moved the cart over a wee bit. So I just kind of moved up. But anyway, by that point, I was in front of the elder. So he's still sitting on the wall at this point. Hasn't made any
Right.
attempt to speak to me, right? So his wife sits next to him on the wall. And I says, I was just explaining to you, and I ran through the whole thing about the years with him, um, explained it, and he was kind of listening. But when I got to the kind of crux of it, um, I went to grab my wee fold here where I put my notes, things I can speak about, and facts and things, um, which I use for even things like arguments against the Trinity, for like using against Trinitarians, not just Jehovah's Witnesses. So I reached for the book. Rather than challenge what I'd said about the chronology, he says, "All right, is that your notes? Is that your notes for poking holes in everything that we believe in?" And I says, "Well, yeah, it is." So he says, "Well, I don't want to see anything from that. You don't tell me anything
Oh,
from that." So I knew what he was doing. He didn't want to answer or make comment about the chronology. So he's trying to change the subject. So I knew he's not going to listen. He's not going to. So he's basically saying, "Don't show me nothing. I don't want to speak about nothing." Um, so he says to me, he says, "I'm not going to say it because you don't want to be convinced." So he's telling me that I don't want to be convinced. How can you know that? Can you read my mind? And I'm saying to no. I says, I want you to preach. If you won't listen to me, you preach to me. I'll stand here and listen to what you say. Preach to me.
yeah,
Convince me then. I'm willing to be
yeah, yeah,
convinced.
yeah.
The wife started going on about all the wonderful conditions of the paradise and all this sort of stuff and how nice, isn't it? The lovely convention they had, an international convention. So I
Yeah.
stopped. I said, "Look, you're actually telling me nothing. You're not
Mm,
using any arguments to convince me of anything. What are you
mm,
saying? Um, so then he then says again, "Look, you're an apostate. Just go away."
yeah,
I says, "Look," I says, "we had this discussion a few months ago when you called me an apostate." I says, "Can you define what an apostate is?" And he said, "No, I don't. I can't define it." So I says, "Well,
fantastic.
how are you able to call me that? If you don't know
Wow.
what it is, why are you sure to call me that?" "Well, I know what an apostate does, but you can't define an apostate. So anyway, starts telling me to go away, to toddle off, and all the kind of usual kind of arrogant and condescending language. that they use.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was basically finished. He didn't really want to talk to me. I'd said everything I needed to say. But I thought, I'm not just going to walk away because you're telling me to walk away. It's a public space, every right to be here. So I
Yeah, yeah.
said, no, I'll just sit on the wall here for a wee while. And anyway, the wife starts talking to me again. And after a minute or so, he came back and he says, look, I don't want you talking to my wife. And I'm like, well, she's talking to me, you know. So I get up, approach the cart again. And then the cheeky sister that wheeled the old lady away, she came back and she could see I was still there. So she says to the elder and the elder's wife, don't look him in the eye. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him, you know. And then she says, she's got her mobile phone in her hand and she says, well, I phone the police. I'll just phone the police, right? So I looks at the elder and I says, really? I says, is that how you handle being questioned about your beliefs? You know, I was being really, really calm. I wasn't getting irate or shouting or anything like that. I was just talking to them, trying to have a conversation. I says, is that how you handle a situation like this when I'm asking you to justify your beliefs? You're going to call the police on me, you know? And of course, I think they realised that and they said no more. But I was thinking about it later. I thought that they're willing to, and this is the second time this has happened to me, they're willing to phone the police to get rid of someone that's asking them questions.
Yeah.
But the congregation won't phone the police if they've got accusations that someone in the congregation has molested a child. You know, really double standards. So he keeps saying, just go away. So I says, well, look, why don't you go away? If you're uncomfortable and not happy
Yes.
here, why don't you go away? So they did.
Yeah.
They cover over the cart and they walks
Off the
off
toddles.
and off they toddled, you know. Um, but
Wow.
I mean, I don't really count that as a success in getting them to move away. I would count a success if they would engage with an argument, if they would engage
Yeah.
with a reasonable debate.
Yeah.
That would be a success in my view. Um, but they went off, and I reminded them. I says, "Well, look, if you're not going to engage with me and try and convince me," I says, "you got to be aware that there's blood guilt there." Because I'm asking you to
Yes.
convince me, and you just
Yeah.
won't engage with an argument. And honestly, that experience, if I hadn't thought before, I'm beyond any belief that the witnesses are a cult. The way that you can't use reason with them, they assume
Yeah.
so much, and they just
Yeah.
disregard any sort of a argument against their position and just blindly accept anything the governing body tell them.
Yeah.
That's cult behavior. There's no two
Yeah.
ways about it. They're not a religion. They're not just a sect. They're a cult, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was the my latest example, where you can't use reason to reason someone out of a position that they never use reason to reach in the first place. So for the rest of the time, I thought I'd speak about just the subject of Faithful and Discreet Slave, which is another thing I've got in my book I'd like to maybe talk about.
Okay.
Going back to my baptism question years ago, I know it's slightly different now, I believe, different questions, but in our day, one of the questions we get asked was about the faithful and discreet slave. You're asked who they are and do you believe that they are running the organization, sort of thing. And of all the questions, I think it was about 100, 130 questions we used to get asked. It was a lot. Of all those questions, that was the one question that sticks in my mind. That when I was answering it, I I did actually hesitate, and I thought to myself, I'll go along with what you are saying on this point because I'm still really young, immature, just growing in knowledge and thinking, well, you've taught me all these things, you must know better than me. So if you're saying that this is what it is, I'll accept it. But I remember being hesitant and thinking to myself, I'm saying yes to that, but I really knew I'd seen no evidence to that.
Yes.
It was more an assertion, but I hadn't really seen a lot of scripture or really been convinced about it. But I've gone along with it, thinking that was for the best. But anyway, so thinking back in that, what did we actually believe back then? I did this yesterday. I had a look at jw.org again. And it's interesting that the Watchtower 1960, July 15th, it talks about the Faithful and Discreet Slave working from or appointed from Pentecost 33 CE, and that they've been feeding the domestics ever since, and that they're now 1900 years old. The Watchtower 76, July 15th, says that the servant or slave, Faithful Discreet Slave, must be the members of spiritual Israel on earth, the Spirit begotten joint heirs with Christ. They must be. And then in Watchtower 81, March the 1st, it says, beginning with Pentecost 33 CE and continuing through the 19 centuries since then, witnesses of Jehovah understand that the slave is comprised of all anointed Christians as a group during these 19 centuries. And when it talks about the domestics, these are the followers as individuals. So 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, 3 decades, they've taught that the faithful and discreet slave were all the anointed Christians from 33 CE all the way through to the 20th century. And in fact, last quote from the 81 issue, it says, we see a clear scriptural basis for saying that all anointed followers of Christ make up God's servant. So that was the position for 3 decades. However, changes started. Watchtower 2013, the July study edition. Now, interestingly, in page 3, and it's also in their Enjoy Life Forever book, the book they use to conduct Bible studies now. It starts off in paragraph 3. Interestingly, it says that this is an illustration, Matthew 24 and verse 45, which is the one that they use about the faithful discreet slave, Matthew 24. Now, it does say illustration, right? But it's interesting that they interpret this literally. They say that this was a literal appointment of the faithful and discreet slave, okay? And yet they're saying it's an illustration. But illustrations are instructive. They're there to just clarify or make easier to understand something that you believe. Well, prophecies are fulfilled because they say in the paragraph that the illustration was fulfilled, right? But illustrations are just simply instructive. Prophecies are fulfilled. They're tying up the word illustration with prophecy, which it's not quite right. But in this paragraph, it says that it recounts those definitions that I've just read out from the 3 previous decades. So it recounts that, but then it says, but after careful study and meditation, we need to clarify this. Right? And this is when they bring in the fact that that it's not the whole group of anointed Christians, okay? And in fact, they go on to say that they weren't appointed in 33 CE. And in fact, there was no faithful discreet slave until 1919. And that's when the faithful discreet slave were basically from. So all those previous 19 centuries, there was no faithful discreet slave appointed, is what they're saying now. Okay, so this was after careful study and meditation. But that made me think, well, they're basically inferring then that all the men that made up the governing body during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, did they not carefully study or meditate on this, right? Because that's what they're inferring. And in actual fact, if we look up some of Rutherford's writings, Rutherford basically says that the faithful and discreet slave and the governing body during Rutherford's period, they were communicated truth by angels. It actually says that in the publications that they were communicated to by angels, right?
Right.
So, but apparently in 2013, there's none of that, and it's just careful study and meditation that the others obviously hadn't done. They go on to say that this illustration is part of the prophecy of Matthew 24, the prophecy of the last days. But they then say that there's two portions of the prophecy, and that the first portion, which is the signs of the times, has two fulfillments in the first century and in the 20th century. But although this illustration is part of the prophecy, it only has a fulfillment in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean,
Right.
how, on
Yeah.
what basis can they say that? How can they split that up? There's nothing in the passage that suggests that the illustration is a prophecy, and it's a prophecy that's only for the 20th century, while the rest of the prophecy applied to both. It's crazy. It's absolute nonsense. They in fact say such a conclusion makes sense. Well, it doesn't make sense to me. So basically saying that the governing body in the first century, which was the apostles and Jesus' brother James the Just in Jerusalem, they're basically saying that they were not part of the faithful and discreet slave. Okay, but the governing body from 1919 are, yeah. So they say that not all anointed Christians have a role in dispensing spiritual food, right? So this is why they're saying it's only the governing body members, because they're the ones that are involved with the Watch the Bible and Tract Society and the production of spiritual food, right?
Yeah.
But what is spiritual food? Is spiritual food not preaching the gospel? Surely it is that the food to dispense are the words of truth. So they're trying to say that all the other anointed are not dispensing food. No, they're really saying that the other anointed are not dispensing the gospel. But surely if they are preaching and teaching, then they're dispensing spiritual food. So again, it's a nonsense what they're saying. And it also goes on in a later paragraph to talk about in recent decades, the slave has been closely identified with the governing body. Well, who says? It's only them, the existing
Everybody.
governing body, that are saying that.
Yes.
It's like a military coup. It's like we've got a certain amount of power, and in fact, we're just going to retain all the power, and we've made that decision ourselves. So, yeah, the other thing about the illustration about the master who appoints his servants, the illustration plays out in that he appoints the servant when he goes away, when he travels abroad, and then he rewards them when he returns. Now they're saying that this only takes place or is fulfilled in 1919. But 1914, 1919 is when they say the master has returned. The illustration says he appoints them when he goes away. So the old understanding of them being appointed a faithful and discreet slave when he leaves the earthly scene in 33 CE, that ties in with what the illustration is saying. It doesn't make sense because if 1914 he has returned with his parousia, then he's here, he's present. He appoints the slave when he's away, not when he's here.
Yes. Right.
Again, it doesn't make sense the way they're interpreting it. Right, I'm just watching the time. There's an awful lot of time left. Also, in the illustration, Jesus also talks about an evil slave, right? And they used to talk about an evil slave class. It was when Rutherford took over the Watchtower, and they said there was an evil slave class. It was basically those of the International Bible Students Association who wouldn't go along with Rutherford, because he was basically just taking over. So they called them the evil slave class. But now they're saying in this 2013 Watchtower that there isn't an evil slave class, because the passage says, if an evil slave. So they're saying that it doesn't necessarily mean there will be. But if we're going to take that tack, then is it really a prophecy? Because if Jesus is saying, about an evil slave, surely it's a prophecy then that an evil slave is going to be apparent, So is it an illustration? Is it a prophecy? They need to make their mind up about that. Right, so very quickly, again, we're running out of time, but quickly, just a last thought on this. Matthew 24:45 is the passage they always point to. But of course, this passage is also present in Luke chapter 12 and Mark chapter 13, but they rarely, if ever, use those two chapters to discuss this illustration. Now, theologians, historians of the Bible, the consensus today is that Mark was the earliest gospel, okay? And that, in fact, Mark was a template for Luke and Matthew. When they wrote their gospels, they used oral traditions. They may have used what's known as the Q source, which is a hypothetical record of sayings and some traditions that they might have used. But they say that mainly they used the book of Mark. So that's why they're known as the synoptic gospels, because they share a lot of similar information. And it's when we compare the three and read the three accounts together, we get additional information from all three that you can add up together. So in Matthew 24, in verse 32, it clearly says in the New World Translation, illustration. And then that chapter talks about the men and the women in the field. It talks about the householder and the thief. It talks about the faithful and discreet slave, the evil slave. Immediately thereafter, Matthew 25 talks about the 10 virgins and their lamps, and then the traveller and the talents. So these are all illustrations or metaphors that Jesus is using to incite constant activity and preparedness in the Christian congregation. Okay, so it's clear it's an illustration. And in Mark 13, in the Watchtower, Mark 13 in the New World Translation, it says in verse 34, it says, "It is like." So it's basically, that's the phrase you use when you're using an analogy. It is like something is like this.
Yeah.
Okay? And in fact, in Watchtower 81, March the 1st, they actually say, quote, "There is no point in trying to force an interpretation of the parable." Right? So they actually use the word, they admit in 81 Watchtower that it is a parable. So why do they interpret it literally if it's an illustration and it's a parable? And if we look at the book of Luke 12 and verse 41, it's interesting that Peter actually says, Luke 12 verse 41, says to Jesus, "Are you saying this illustration to us or to all?" Now, the us there was actually four of the apostles. It was James, Peter, John, and Andrew who were sitting with him at that time. So they're saying, are you talking to just us and they four maybe representative of the apostles, or are you saying it to all? So in Luke, Jesus doesn't basically answer it directly as such, but what he goes on to say is about the faithful slave and describes the evil slave. So he's basically saying the parable doesn't formally appoint a man or a group of men as a ruling body, because he's already appointed the 12 apostles. That's who he has appointed to be in charge, the 12 apostles and his brother James. But the parable was a hortatory speech, an exhortation to remain active. Now, it's interesting in the James Moffat translation that I like using. James Moffat, he says in Luke, sorry, let me just, sorry, Mark 13, Mark account 13 and verse 37, when he's used this question about is it who are you speaking to? Is it to just us, the small group, or is it to all? In verse 37, Jesus says, I say it to you, and I say it to all. And in Luke 21, sorry, Luke 12 it is. In the Luke passage, Luke 12, um, he says, I say it to all and sundry, right? To all and sundry. So basically saying, what I'm saying to you about being a faithful and discreet slave is to all, right? So the
Oh,
apostles were asking, is it just us as a governing body,
yeah,
or is it to everyone? Jesus is
yeah.
saying it's to all and sundry. And in
Hmm.
fact, I looked up another translation. I get a lot of these translations from a website called Bible Gateway. If you know, it's a really good website,
Yeah,
and you can get put in one verse and you get a whole load of
yeah. I've
translations.
I've done it before because of course I got rid of all my Bibles, and so I
Right.
then started not to want to use New World Translation. So when I was doing some of my Let's Read the Scripture, I would use one of the other versions, which made a little bit more sense, if you know what I mean. That was easier to understand because I thought I can't rely on New World Translation anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, in this verse, I found quite an obscure translation. I've not seen this one before, but it's called the Voice Translation from 2012. And it puts it really nicely, that last verse in Luke 12. It says, quote, the teaching I am giving the four of you now is for everyone who will follow me. Right?
Right.
So I don't think it can be any clearer than that. When the
Yeah.
apostles are asking, is it just us? Jesus is saying, it's not just for you, it's for everyone. Because the exhortation of the parable is that everyone is to stay attentive, stay active, being productive, waiting for the master's return. He's not going to say that just to a few, and everybody else just does nothing. And it's only this small group of men that have to be active. Jesus is saying, you've all to be faithful and discreet slaves. Everyone who follows me has got to hear this exhortation and be active Christians, basically. And one maybe last final thought. I was also thinking about the church fathers, the patristic period, and the likes of Irenaeus and Origen and such. That's an interesting book, Irenaeus of Lyon, on the apostolic preaching, and he goes through basically what the apostles believed, all the teachings in the early centuries, and of course there's no use of the faithful and discreet slave as if it means a small group, appointed body who are in charge and only them. There's nothing of that in here. There's nothing of the apostolic succession either, because of course they believed the end was coming.
Yeah.
There wasn't need to be any more apostles because the end was going to come. But the church fathers only talk about the faithful and discreet slave in terms of exhorting bishops and presbyters to be active in helping the flocks, and about Christians in general. They don't talk
Yeah.
about it as being a small select group of Christians who are in overall charge. There's none of it. The Jehovah's Witnesses are the only ones that come out with this, converting what is clearly a parable, but teaching it as if it's a literal appointment, which is clearly the scriptures don't hold that. So that's all I've got
Right.
for tonight.
Well, no,
Just
I think
managed
that's
to get
enough.
through it all.
You did pretty well, actually. Got 4 minutes to go to say your goodbye. So,
4 minutes,
yeah, so
that's
you
not a
got,
bad time.
yeah, four. That was pretty good, actually. Well, well done.
Mm.
So, yeah, there was, yeah, more food for thought. Yeah, again, it's like maybe you should, maybe this, in fact, it's quite interesting that, so they say after careful consideration. And I think you are carefully considering a lot of things, which shows if you're doing this with careful consideration as yourself, what are these guys doing when they're supposed to be carefully considering as a group of men? Are they really carefully considering? Clearly they're not.
And it's this whole thing about spirit direction and you the spirit when you read the Bible. I mean, I think that they have got no more clue or understanding over
Yeah,
these
yeah,
things than
no,
any of us.
e- exactly.
There's,
That's
nothing to
that's the
stop.
point I'm trying to make. No, you're just as scholarly as they are, and maybe even more. That's the point. You know, I mean, literally, they're just making that shit up, to suit their own purposes, to like longevity to the organization. It's just utter nonsense. Anyway, yeah, we're gonna have to go now. So, thank you again, Dino, for your wonderful research and also your rather interesting cart busting tale again. Keep up the good work, and we'll hopefully get another interesting chat this time
Friday.
next week for everybody who likes this. Oh, we're meeting on Friday as well in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And also,
Glasgow,
again,
beware.
yeah, Glasgow, beware. There could be some more court busting happening in Glasgow afternoon. Yeah, so anyway, so if you like this, anybody watches this, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up, the like, and hopefully it'll get to a wider audience. And maybe we can start using some of the experiences Dino's got when we meet them ourselves. Right, Dino, it's time for you to say goodbye.
Okay, good night, all. Thanks again, Terry. See you later.
See you later. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye for now.